About 500 years ago, the Bible was forever changed. This was the first point in history where there were chapters and verses added in. And the reason for this was so that it would be a lot easier for people to study it and refer to different points in the Bible. I mean, imagine if there weren't chapters and I wanted to talk to you today about Matthew 17. I would have to tell you, hey, go to the book of Matthew and then go to the part where it's the Mount of Transfiguration. And unless you know the book of Matthew pretty well, then it would be hard for you to know where I'm talking about. And furthermore, verses help us really narrow down to be able to study more particularly about certain stories. The problem is sometimes it can let us see the Bible as incomplete, incoherent, or even in where there's problems in the scripture. And I'll give you an example of this. It says in Matthew 16, and this is the same for Mark before the story of Transfiguration. And I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And then the chapter ends. So if you read that verse and then the chapter ends, you think to yourself, oh, well, Jesus hasn't come back yet. And no one saw the Son of Man coming in his glory. Like, this isn't true. Like, Jesus made a claim here that didn't. But if you read it without chapters, you would just naturally go in to the Mount of Transfiguration. So that is Matthew 17. It begins like this. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, led them up on a high mountain to be alone. So real quick, it says 6 days later there. This story is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the three synoptic gospels. And in Matthew, Mark, it says 6 days later. And then in Luke, it says 8 days later. And so that may seem like a contradiction to us, but what Luke is doing there is he's saying a more approximate time, where Matthew and Mark are saying more of an exact time. So what I mean by that is that the word in Luke's gospel, if you go and read it in the Net Study Bible, they actually have an interesting commentary on this, but it essentially is saying more like a week versus 6 days, which is practically a week. So anyways, let's keep reading. Matthew 17:2. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared and began to talk with Jesus. Now, here's something that's really interesting. Peter, later on in the story, realizes that it's Moses and Elijah. How would he be able to do that? See, Jewish people during this time period would never have paintings of themselves or anyone because they saw it as idolatry. So how would they know what Moses and Elijah were supposed to look like if there weren't any paintings of it? Now take back to the promise that Jesus made. He said, I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So we think about this like heaven coming to earth, which is what happened here in the Mount of Transfiguration. Then when Peter, James, and John went up onto the mountain, they were able to have knowledge that they wouldn't have otherwise had. See, I personally believe that we're not going to get to heaven and have to ask God a bunch of questions like a lot of people think. Oh, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this or ask God that. I think that God will give us knowledge when we get to heaven that we didn't have here on earth. And we're getting a glimpse of this here on the Mount of Transfiguration, where Peter is given knowledge that he shouldn't have otherwise had. Now, why Moses and Elijah? It kind of seems like odd people to just randomly bring up. But for starters, I think that it's because Moses represents the law of Moses, the Mosaic law. The first 5 books of the Bible were written by him. So he represents the law. And then Elijah represents the prophets. So you have the law and the prophets coming down to meet Jesus, who is the Messiah that fulfills the law and the prophets. Furthermore, we see that Moses dies before he enters the promised land, yet he's coming down as a part of heaven. And then Elijah is taken up into heaven. So we have people that die here on earth, and then you have people that are raptured. So I think it's a great example for believers that if you die before you enter the promised land or heaven, then you'll still go to heaven if you're bought in the blood of Christ. But if you're raptured out, which is what happens in the book of Revelation, then you can go to heaven also. That they're both in heaven, even though they died in separate ways. Well, Elijah technically didn't die, but I think you understand the point. There's 2 more things that I think are really important here. The second, it says This is what Peter says. This is what Peter says in verse 4. Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." So he says 3 shelters. In the original Greek, the word is tabernacles. So to set the stage for you on that a little bit, this tabernacle was what Moses first built in order for God's presence to come on earth. And there's this great kind of imagery that you get with the tabernacle and the temple is that it represents the Garden of Eden. And there's, not to go super deep into that, but there's a lot of ways that they are reflective of the Garden of Eden, or heaven on earth. So here it is, heaven's coming to earth, and what's Peter, a Jew's first response? We need to build the tabernacle. But what Jesus is coming here to do on earth is to allow God's presence to dwell on earth through believers without a physical structure. Now, furthermore, Peter does something wrong here. He conflates Moses and Elijah as being equivalent to Jesus, and then he's rebuked. It says in verse 5, "But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my dearly loved son, with whom brings me great joy. Listen to him.' Then the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground." Later on in the same chapter, it says, "As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead.'" Why would Jesus not want to tell anyone? Now, this is important, and I'm going to talk about it later whenever we talk about the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark. But essentially, Jesus commonly tells people not to tell others about who he is while he was here on earth, which is an odd thing to do, but it is because when Jesus finally reveals who he is, when he revealed that he was the Messiah, when he reveals that he is the Son of God, he is killed immediately after that. And you see this at the end of the Gospels when the Pharisees, they'll tear their clothes whenever he revealed that he was the Messiah. So in order for him to stay alive and to accomplish what he needed to accomplish before the cross, they had to keep things like this a secret. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and it gave you some more perspective on the Mount Transfiguration, then please leave a like. It really does help the channel, and I'll see you back here later as we continue to read through Scripture together.